All right, we left off last week and want to spend the first portion of our time this morning looking at the interpretive issues of the book of Leviticus. And we had spoken about that first interpretive problem, which is what is the structure of the book. And I walked through with you the structure, but now we can certainly show you the notes, and you will see that I would outline Leviticus with two major divisions, and lump together what in CCC are different divisions. But certainly there's a block of material in the first 7 chapters, the legislation concerning the offerings, followed by the installation into the priesthood of Aaron's family, chapters 8 to 10, and then the instruction concerning clean and unclean that leads to the instruction concerning the Day of Atonement in chapter 16. And I would relate all of those as the way to the Holy God. That this is the means by which Israel maintained their personal relationship with Yahweh. They came into His presence. And certainly they reflected their relationship with Yahweh in a holy walk, which is the emphasis of chapter 17 to 27. And now you see how my outline pretty much correlates with the outline that you have in the world and the Word. And chapter 17 refers again to the fact of Israel's stumbling because of idolatry, a stumbling that obviously continues throughout their history in the Old Testament. So there is a definite structure. And I follow the commentaries that I've given to you that all will in some way try to bring the text together into a coherent structure. Now, what is most important, again, is to realize that we have to understand the book of Leviticus, as any of the so-called books of the Torah, against the structure of the Torah as a whole. And of course we have seen that again, and we'll see it also as we come to Numbers, which actually is viewed by the commentators as possibly even more random than even Leviticus, as far as a organized structure is concerned. But let's just move on and take a look at some of these other interpretive issues as far as Leviticus is concerned. And you probably don't realize it as you read in Leviticus 1:1, but there is, when the Lord speaks to Moses from the tent of meeting. What is that tent of meeting? And of course, and I would go along with the interpretation, this is the tabernacle. This is the tent of meeting that is referred to in Exodus chapter 40. So in verse 34, Exodus chapter 40, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting, because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord had filled the tabernacle. And it seems from those two verses that tent of meeting, the place where Yahweh now dwells, and the place where He is going to interact with His people, that this now is the tabernacle. The tabernacle equals the tent of meeting. The temple of meeting equals the tabernacle, the tent. This is where this takes place. And of course, that's where the majority of the commentators would land. That this is the closest statement as far as the tent of the meeting as far as Leviticus 1:1. And realize again, there is no break. There is no major break between Exodus chapter 40 and then moving into Leviticus chapter 1. However, there had been a previous tent of meeting where the Lord had met Moses. And that was spoken of back in chapter 33 of the book of Exodus. And there are a small minority of commentators that would relate this back to Exodus chapter 33. Verse 7. And Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, a good distance from the camp. And he called it the tent of meeting. It came about that when anyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. And it came about whenever Moses went out to the tent that all the people would arise and stand, each at the entrance of his tent, and gaze after Moses until he entered the tent. So this tent was outside of the camp, and as Moses would set it up, he would go outside of the camp, and that is where the Lord would meet him. In fact, verse 11, thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face in this tent outside of the camp, just as a man speaks to his friend. When Moses returned to the camp, his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. So the tent is left outside the camp. Joshua is the overseer of that tent, and that is where Moses would go to meet the Lord. Now, what is the context of Exodus chapter 33? The context of Exodus chapter 33 is the after effects of the golden calf incident, where Israel has been shown to be in covenant disobedience, and even Moses now has to leave the camp to a tent of meeting to meet with the Lord. That without the forgiveness of the Lord and with the reinstitution of the covenant in Exodus chapter 34, there was no way that the Lord could come and dwell in the midst of Israel. But the steps are taken, forgiveness takes place, the covenant is renewed, and of course in chapters 35 to 40 we see the building of the tabernacle so that Yahweh's presence no longer is outside the camp. Moses no longer has to go outside the camp to a tent of meeting that is there, but now the Lord is in the midst of his covenant people. So there's a change of circumstances between Exodus chapter 33 and Exodus chapter 40. And of course, Leviticus is speaking to that change situation where the Lord has taken up his residence in the midst of his people. Again, because there had been forgiveness and the sin of the golden calf had been dealt with and the covenant had been renewed. And so the tabernacle could be built and Yahweh could live among his people. So we have no indication from the rest of the Torah that now the tabernacle has been built, that Moses would go outside the camp to meet with the Lord face to face. From here on out, from Leviticus chapter 1, that the Lord meets Moses, Yahweh meets Moses in the tabernacle. So the tent of meeting there is not the previous tent where Yahweh had spoken to Moses, but the tabernacle, and that is the place from now when Yahweh will communicate through Moses to speak to the sons of Israel. Now, probably the major interpretive issue of the book of Leviticus is issue number 3. How do we understand the text when it speaks of these sacrifices, these offerings making atonement. And of course, we have used that word atonement in theological terms, and we have had it a lot of material that the Bible speaks about salvation, redemption, and tied it all into different theories of atonement. But we have to just look at this point. What does this word mean within its context as far as Exodus and the Torah are concerned? What does it mean to make atonement? And beginning with the burnt offering in 1:4, we're introduced to this, that the burnt offering may be accepted for him to make atonement on his, that is, the offerer's behalf. And of course, we've also spoken about the important ritual that takes place in Leviticus chapter 16, which is a day on which atonement shall be made for Israel to cleanse you, and you shall be clean from all your sins before the Lord. So atonement leads to cleansing, it leads to forgiveness, it leads to one being accepted, being able to come into the presence of Yahweh. But what is the meaning of the verb itself? What does it mean to make atonement? And as you can see, there have been a number of suggestions that have been made, and you're probably very familiar with the first one, that atonement basically means to cover, that the sin is covered. And some would use the root being used in Genesis chapter 6:14, where the pitch, covered the ark of Noah. But actually, the root might be better, that it is wiped. It is there is a wiping on or a wiping off. And it seems as though this is the basic understanding of the term, that it means to wipe away, to purge, to cleanse. But it's also used in context too, and this might be the association of the term, that it's associated with the term to ransom. So not just to smear or to wipe, i.e. wipe on or wipe off, but it could also have the concept of being associated with another root, same consonants, that is associated with ransom. And a number of exegetes on Leviticus actually have brought the two together, that it does have the idea of wiping away, of cleansing when an object is involved. It's interesting that even the vessels of the tabernacle, that they have to be dealt with in the proper way, that they might be atoned for. Even in the Day of Atonement, that the tabernacle itself, needs atonement, and so cleansing. That there is a sense in which now this is a wiping away. But what does that wiping away mean when you're dealing with a person? It means that we're dealing with a ransom. That is a price that is paid, substitution. And so the term itself both has the idea based upon, as far as an individual is concerned, based upon a substitute, that there can be an appeasing, there can be a wiping away of the wrath of God based upon the ransom that is given, the payment price, which in this situation is the animal. And so it's not just a mere expiation, not just a mere washing away of sin, but the fact that there is reconciliation, a ransom has been received, the offering is burned up, which allows God to wipe away the sin and wipe away the wrath, turn away his wrath. And of course that is the way that the term used in Greek is going to be picked up and used in the four places where the root is used in the New Testament. It's a turning away of the wrath of God. So that there is a wiping away of wrath that leads to a wiping away, a cleansing of sin based upon the fact, and even if the word is not association cannot be completely shown, nevertheless the greater context is that this forgiveness, this cleansing takes place because a ransom has been offered and a ransom has been accepted. So all of those ideas really of B, C, and as you can see brought together in D are all part of the idea of atonement, that this term that is used, kepar, the verb, and kippur, the noun, that are translated to make atonement, or the noun, the atonement that has been made. And this is our best understanding of the verb, that on the basis of ransom paid, then there can be a turning away of God's wrath, and there can be a wiping away of the sin. Now, the verb itself doesn't answer the question of the relationship between these animals that were sacrificed in the Old Testament and how that relates to Jesus Christ in the New Testament. But obviously we can see that animals were needed day in and day out, that sacrifices had to be brought on a daily, weekly, monthly basis for Israel, as far as also the Day of Atonement offering, once a year for Israel. We talked last week about how that looks back at we can only by faith look ahead and see that the same God who provided in the past is going to provide offerings in the future. But nevertheless, they were efficacious. They were efficacious for the turning away of God's wrath and forgiveness of sins. And of course, we find out from the New Testament that their efficacy comes because they pointed toward the final sacrifice that was in Jesus Christ. And so that's my best understanding. And certainly it's a place where you can do more study and you can do some more theological reflection upon how this ties in with a greater understanding of what Jesus Christ did on the cross when you get to the doctrine of soteriology in your theology classes. So I would lean too. I would lean with Wenham and Rooker to the fact that the basic idea of the term is to cleanse. And particularly when we're dealing with a person, that cleansing is based upon a substitute, and so can think in terms of the fact of cleansing that has been brought to pass because a ransom has been paid, and so therefore ransom, that an individual has been ransomed, and God's wrath has been turned away, can certainly be implied from this root within the context. And this is what the burnt offering was for. This is what the sin offering was for, that atonement might be made, and that sin could be dealt with on the basis of a substitutionary animal that takes the place of the worshiper and is accepted by God in the place of the worshiper. And all this then leads to atonement. I don't know if there's any further questions on that. You, to a certain extent, you'll get more into it as you get into to Hebrew and, as I said, into theology. But I would lean away from seeing it as covering. I would see it more tying together B and C and D. All right, then we're told on a number of occasions, and I have listed the verses for you, that individuals guilty of certain offenses were to be cut off from the people, cut off from Israel. We see it first in chapter 7, dealing with the peace offering. But the person who eats the flesh of the sacrifice of the peace offerings, which belongs to the Lord, in his uncleanness, that person shall be cut off from his people. And you go through, and a number of other offenses are relayed as someone who disobeys, being cut off from his people. The last one in Leviticus chapter 23 deals with what takes place on the Day of Atonement. On that day, verse 28, neither shall you do any work on this same day, for it's a day of atonement, to make atonement on your behalf before the Lord your God. If there is any person who will not humble himself on this same day, he shall be cut off from his people. All right, so what does it mean to be cut off? Is it the fact that he's cut off by death? Well, it's interesting that there are offenses that call for the death penalty. Multiple examples of that as you go through the Torah. And yet there's, if death, therefore, was to be the consequence, it seems as though it could have been stated more clearly than being cut off from the community. And you can see that none of the commentators see this as death. And I would go along with that because there is clear ways in which death can be stated. And certainly this gives us a different concept. And so what is it? Cut off from his people means that they're excommunicated from worship, that they are cut off from the people, maybe even placed outside the camp, that there's something that physically, by these statements, the assembly of Israel is to do, that if this person, offends in this way, then they are to cut this person off. Or it seems better with the third position, it's just a statement. If there's any person who will not humble himself on this same day. What we find out is some of these are attitudes of heart. And who is the only one who knows the attitudes of the heart? The Lord. And so, certainly the others, obviously, if someone partakes of the peace offering on the third day, that's clearly evident. I mean, you can add up 1, 2, and this is the third day, and you're still eating it. You are guilty. But the statement might not be something the community is called to do as much as a statement to the community on what God does to that person. That this individual is placed under a divine curse that results in God's judgment. A judgment that in certain instances might include death. So in other words, by an individual disobeying, all right, the Lord shall cut that person off from his people, that they are no longer a part, as it were, of his people receiving his blessing, but they are under a divine curse, and then how that curse might work itself out, all right, is left up to the Lord. In fact, going through Torah and the Old Testament, commentators say, well, particularly if a woman who is under God's curse might be childless, and of course a male might be cut off in premature death. But nevertheless, because of these offenses against Yahweh, there are serious repercussions. And this is what Leviticus is reminding the Israelites of. And even secret things known only to the Lord that might not have any outward manifestation. Still, that individual knows that they can be cut off from the people. They can be removed from the place of blessing to a place of curse. That brings God's certain and sure judgment upon them. And again, a curse is just a removal of blessing. It is the fact that now one receives the just recompense for what they have done against the Lord, and that could include death. But the reason why it doesn't say and he dies is because the cutting off doesn't necessarily, in every circumstance, lead to death. So this is something, again, reminds Israel of the seriousness that if they do not take seriously, soberly, and obey what God has said, then to God they will answer. And that's a good segue into Leviticus chapter 10. Leviticus chapter 10, and Nadab and Abihu, and as I like to call it, the original strange fire conference, and it did not end up too well. Nadab and Abihu had a conference with the Lord, and talk about the Lord dealing with someone in accordance with their sin. That's exactly what takes place. And so in chapter 10, verse 1, all right, and we've just come through the setting apart and installation of Aaron and his 4 sons into the priesthood. And now, and it seems, very quickly after this installation has taken place, the 2 of those sons, Nadab and Abihu, sons of Aaron, 10:1, took their respective fire pans, and after putting fire in them, placed incense on them and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. Now, I think, simply the offense that is stated in 10:1 is this. They brought their fire pans and did not have the proper fire. They did not have the proper coals. And you can see that in some way probably stems from the fact that they brought fire before the Lord, which they should not have brought. But it's interesting that along with the strange fire, as you take a look at other statements concerning this incident within this context, and then in chapter 16, that there are some further dynamics as well. Possibly, though this is not the sin, but it is the situation that these priests found themselves that led to this sin, is interestingly immediately after this had taken place, and stated how the bodies were to be dealt with, that the Lord then spoke to Aaron, verse 8, saying, "Do not drink wine or strong drink," emphasizing neither you nor your sons with you when you come into the tent of meeting, so that you may not die. Well, who just died? Well, 2 sons of Aaron, you and your sons. Don't drink wine or strong drink. It's this perpetual statute throughout your generations. So what has led Nadab and Abihu to bring the wrong fire, the strange fire, before the Lord? Well, it might have been the fact that their sensibilities were dull because of drunkenness. Now, drunkenness is not the sin. But as in many cases within our own society, is a contributing factor. That with strong drink, Proverbs 31 will remind us, this is not for rulers, that their judgment not be clouded by strong drink. I'm not dealing here anyway in application. I'm just trying to point out what's in the text. A priest in the Old Testament, that they might fulfill their duties properly before the Lord, were not to drink. They were not to find themselves in a drunken condition. But further insight is also given in chapter 16, which gives this context. Now the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the 2 sons of Aaron, when they approached the presence of the Lord and died. And the Lord said to Moses, "Tell your Aaron that he shall not enter at any time into the holy place, inside the veil, before the mercy seat which is on the ark, lest he die." It seems that they actually brought the strange fire into the very presence of the Lord in the most holy place, in the tabernacle. So it's not just what they brought and the condition they were in that clouded their judgment, but also where they went. So they, as we might put it, they brought the wrong fire at the wrong time in the wrong place. And so the Lord makes it clear, only one person, one time a year, entering in to the most holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat, which is on the ark, lest he die, for I will appear in the cloud over the mercy seat. Well, and this is a reminder to Aaron too. Once again, coming into the very presence of God, coming to where the cloud, fire representing God, is there above the mercy seat. That you want to make sure you come on the right day, in the right way, with the right offerings, that you've gone through it just exactly, because coming into the presence of the Lord, as I said last week, is a dangerous proposition. So I think it is improper coals from the altar, rather than the fact it could be improper incense, going back to Exodus chapter 30. But I think also A and D should not be discounted either, that all of this is tied in together, that they went into the most holy place on a day other than the 10th day of the 7th month. And by the way, they weren't the high priest. They were only sons of the high priest. So we got all kinds of problems here. You know, wrong place, wrong time, wrong men, and not even bringing the proper coals from the altar. And all because their judgment was clouded because they were drunk. So you put it all together, and you've got total disobedience, which leads to God's judgments. And is a reminder to the priests from here on out that you represent God. And you will do things God's way, or there will be a price, a serious price of judgment to pay. Now, brothers, we are not Aaronic priests. We're just shepherds. Shepherds of God's flock. But we need to be reminded that when God calls a man and sets a man apart unto his service, and that's exactly the priests. The priests were consecrated, set apart, sanctified. They are no longer common. And there is a greater responsibility for the priests in the Old Testament because of their set-apart position. And certainly there is in the New Testament too, that there is a greater responsibility is laid upon those who are set apart for God's service. So we're not priests, but take to heart that we too should make sure that with sober judgment we never do the wrong thing at the wrong time in the wrong place and with the wrong people. And that would be my application, of Leviticus chapter 10. And you're going to find out a lot more application of Leviticus chapter 10 in 2 weeks. And by the way, this is a 4-hour class, so you got to go to 4 hours of the conference to make up, for missing class that week. So just a reminder. And then what about the unclean animals? And I think I've already said enough about this. That I would see that this is basically sea animals used to make a distinction between Israel and the nations. And in some way, clean animals symbolize Israel and unclean animals symbolize the Gentiles. It's interesting in Genesis, and of course, as Israel's hearing the Torah on the plains of Moab, they've already heard about clean and unclean, the distinction between the two as far as the animals that went on the ark. And the fact that there are more clean animals because those are what Noah offered, chapter 8, after the flood was over. So there is some kind of distinction, even before Israel, of a clean and an unclean animal. But nevertheless, certainly, when we get to Acts chapter 10, everything is clean, everything can be eaten, but within the Old Testament, there's some kind of the fact that clean animals represent that which is clean, unclean animals represent that which is unclean. And it could be, again, that what is in Genesis is proleptic. It's nothing that comes inherently from creation. We'd have a hard time figuring out exactly what that is. But the fact that this is this distinction that God is going to make. Certainly it is a reminder of the spiritual conditions of humans. It does seem at times to us that this might be somewhat arbitrary. The rationale between clean and unclean animals is only known to God himself. But I think predominantly the point is C. By the way, pagans did use at time unclean animals, but they also, like Israel, used clean animals in their sacrifices as well. And the fact that somehow these are unhygienic animals, and somehow there's going to be greater health risks, before, and I've seen this before refrigeration. Acts chapter 10, that was before refrigeration as well. I mean, to say that today we're able to, preserve animals, I mean, there was not a great deal of distinction between how meat was preserved, before Acts 10 and after Acts chapter 10. So I have a problem with A, I have a problem with B. It just doesn't fit the facts. And it seems C, that this is a distinction It is something that God is using, again, to show the set-apart status of Israel. You're my sanctified people, therefore you cannot eat these foods the Gentiles eat. It's another way of making a distinction between Israel and the nations. And then finally, before I take questions, just the Day of Atonement, chapter 16, that we have a term that has come into English, the scapegoat, thanks to the King James translators. Going back to Tyndale, that this term Azael, so the goat on which the lot for Azael fell, Leviticus 16:10, shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement upon it, to send it into the wilderness as Azael. All right, so is Azael a proper name? Is it a name for the wilderness itself? Is it a name for a demon to which, the goat is sent? Well, probably it's not a name, even though my New American Standard gives that as an option, that the scapegoat can be just the proper name, Azael. And then is that a name, as I said, for the wilderness? Is it a name for the demon? Or is Azael to be looked at as what is the meaning of that name? And then what is the name? Does it mean entire removal, complete destruction? So it goes into the wilderness as the goat that removes the goats, that itself suffers the destruction. Or probably better just simply here as Azael, that is, as the goat of removal, the goat that departs, the goat that leaves. So scapegoat is somewhat interpretively interpreted. Now that's what it's doing. It is taking, once again, the sin. It is taking the sin and bearing it away, and is going to die in the wilderness, and once again die the death that sin and sinners deserved because of their sinful condition. But probably just means here to send in the wilderness as the departing goat, as the goat that is removed from the camp and goes into the wilderness. So seeing here not a name, but what the name represents, and I would star that it is a. You can read Rooker, who tries to defend the fact that it's a proper name and stands for the first domain that's to be sent in the wilderness as Azael, as the one who endures the fierce terrain of the wilderness for the people of God. Now, if you're going to take it as a proper name, I think that's stronger than taking it as a name of a demon. That somehow a ransom has been paying to a demon that is outside the camp. But interestingly, even Kylan Dalich accepted that meaning of Azael here in Leviticus 16. So here are some of the major interpretive issues that have been wrestled with as far as the book is concerned. And before we take a break, let's see if there's any questions that you have.
I'm a little confused on the burnt offering because it was to atone for human sinfulness, but it's a free will offering.
Right.
So it wasn't compulsory to bring. So is that then to atone for sin that you're not conscious of or aware of?
I think it really is to acknowledge your sinful estate. And I would see the burnt offering, particularly the culminating, sin has taken place, sin and guilt have to be dealt with, and one realizes, okay, yes, the breach has been repaired. All right, the sin has been dealt with, the sin has been forgiven, but there's a realization that I sin because I am a sinner. And so in that way, that the burnt offering is an atonement on behalf of the sinner. He recognizes his sinful condition and wants to reiterate his total and complete commitment to Yahweh. Now, obviously the first time we see the burnt offering is in Genesis chapter 8, after the flood. And Noah at that point, wouldn't necessarily be conscious of any personal sin. He has been faithful to the Lord, obeying his commands, but he would have been very, very aware of the fact that, okay, the flood has come, and now the flood is abated, but the flood has been a result of human sinfulness. And so he wants to really confess, I believe, in chapter 8, two things. The fact that he realizes that he continues himself to be a sinner, and as a sinner, he wants to reaffirm his total and complete dedication to the Lord, and the way to do so is through a burnt offering. And that's the reason why I believe it's number one, a free will offering. You don't have to, you're not under compulsion if there's sin to necessarily bring this offering. But it's a realization that, all right, just taking care of the sin is not enough. There has to be a positive restatement again of my total commitment to Yahweh. And that total commitment to Yahweh, and yet I still realize that I am tainted. I am still a sinner. And so the idea seems to be that, okay, I sin because I'm a sinner. And I recognize that, and that's what the burnt offering is used to testify before the Lord. And the Lord accepts it, as a sweet aroma. And the result of that, or the foundation of that, could be either way, is the fact that there is harmony. There is now shalom. There has been a renewal of the relationship between Yahweh and the sinner, which is also then testified to in the peace offering.
And that was kind of with my next question. The free will offerings would be brought when the worshiper is in a perceived state of harmony with God.
Yes.
There's no known sin. And when there is a known sin, you realize you've sinned unintentionally or intentionally. Unintentionally would be for the sin, the guilt offering. You had to do that. And then after you did that, then you could bring free will offerings again.
Yes, and I would concur with that. And the statement was that you're under compulsion when you sin, and you cannot bring the free will offerings until that is dealt with. Then you're in a state where you can bring these free will offerings to Yahweh. I would concur with that.
And then the Day of Atonement is the only sacrifices for intentional deliverance.
In my understanding, the Day of Atonement is the only atonement for unintentional sin. And in fact, it can be for any unintentional or intentional sin that has not, unintentional sin that has not been dealt with the sin and guilt offering previously. So it's all the sins of Israel, cumulative, looking back to the previous year. It looks back. It looks back to what took place the last 360 days. It doesn't anticipate anything as far as the next 360 days are concerned. You just live by faith that, all right, what happens in the next 360 days is going to be dealt with by Yahweh, in the Day of Atonement coming up. So it's anticipation. I mean, again, the Old Testament is saying it has to live by faith. he might have some things where he can live by sight in a way that you and I can't. But still, his life has to be a life lived by faith. He still has to trust in the goodness of Yahweh. We look back and see God's faithfulness. He looks back and sees a certain level of God's faithfulness, and on that basis looks ahead and says, all right, I believe that God was going to be faithful to me in the same way in the future. Now, to a certain extent, we live with the same kind of tension as well. We might have more certainty this side of the cross because, Jesus has died, and we have the testimony of that in Scripture. And having not seen, we believe. We believe what took place at the cross. We believe in the resurrection, the ascension. But our sight, our faith is not yet completely sight. So, we might have, and can look back to a stronger recognition of what God has done as the basis of what He's going to do in the future, but still we too live in hope. What God has promised, He is going to fulfill totally and completely in the future as well. So the particulars might be a little different, but it's the same kind of a life of faith lived by the Old Testament saint as by the New Testament saint, or vice versa, because he came first, so we're like him. And he obviously anticipates, we're going to live like this side of the cross. So you can't live, without faith. It's impossible to please God. And that has been true for God's people from beginning until, the culmination. We have to have faith. And of course, we'll live with, we might put it this way, a faith that is completed, throughout eternity. We won't need faith anymore, because sight we'll experience the presence of God, we'll experience the blessing of God, etc. So faith will finally become sight in the eternal state. All right, preaching Leviticus. Most of you are going to preach Leviticus when you preach Hebrews. I'm not sure too many of you are going to begin early in your ministry. I'm going to do an exposition of the book of Leviticus. But gentlemen, when you get to Hebrews, you will be studying and you will be going back and giving your people what is in Leviticus. And you might want to pull off somewhere in chapters 4 through 10 that are dealing with the priesthood and the sacrifice. At that point, you might want to pull off and deal with what is in the book of Leviticus. You might find yourself giving a full exposition at that point. Or if not, you will certainly be going back and showing the correspondence, that is, the similarities and differences between what is being said in Hebrews for the New Testament believer as what was given to the Old Testament believer in the book of Leviticus. So ultimately, if you preach enough of the New Testament, you will get to Leviticus in your preaching. So, and when you do, hopefully these notes will give you some benefit and encouragement as you study. All right, I think there was one more hand before.
All right. I do have a question. It wasn't me, so whoever else. But anyways, as far as the woman with the in the New Testament, the woman with the discharge for like 20 years who touched Jesus. After reading the book of Leviticus, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly from perhaps her mindset. Because Leviticus, if I'm reading it correctly, she would technically be unclean.
Yeah, the woman in Mark chapter 5 who had the issue of blood for 18 years is unclean.
So she could not touch anything holy, otherwise she would be killed. Is that correct?
Yes.
So
she would be under God's curse, yeah.
So for her to have the audacity to think that she could touch the Son of God, I mean, that really took some courage. Like,
it was audacious, you're right. It was an audacious act.
Okay, so that is historically then in line with, like...
Yeah, because the unclean is coming into contact with the Holy One.
Okay.
And we see a reversal of Leviticus. Because in Leviticus, her uncleanness would have made Jesus unclean. Rather, what takes place is, Jesus, the Holy Son of God, her touch of faith leads to her cleansing. You know, at that very moment, what? The issue is dried up, which shows you that here is the one sent by God who can overcome, man's, woman's uncleanness. All right. It's interesting too that Mark chapter 1, that Jesus touched the leper and healed him. So that's an audacious act on the part of Jesus. All right, the fact that, wait a minute, if you touch a leper, you become unclean. No, I touch the leper, he becomes clean. This, if you know your Old Testament, is a great indication of what the Bible is asserting concerning Jesus Christ. He is God, the one who can overcome that which is unclean. And the only one. If you're unclean and touch my garment, then we both become unclean. All right, if you're unclean, I touch you, we both become unclean. But with Jesus, it was reversed. The unclean comes in contact with the holy, and the uncleanness is taken away. So, yeah, good. That's where knowing the Old Testament helps you understand better what is in the New Testament. That's a good point.